There is a stranger sleeping a few feet from you tonight, on the other side of a wall. You don't know his name, and you don't think twice about it, because this is just what a city is. Right now, you are probably within a few hundred meters of dozens of people you have never met and never will. You share walls with strangers. You walk past strangers. You breathe the same air as strangers on buses and in hallways and in lifts, and you do not think twice about any of it, because this is just what cities are. It is the background noise of modern life. For most of human history, that would not have felt like background noise. It would have felt like a threat. For 300,000 years, humans lived in bands of roughly 30 to 50 people. You knew every face. You knew every name. You knew who was reliable, who was dangerous, who had helped you last winter, and who had taken more than their share. The entire social world fit inside a single clearing. Strangers were not just unfamiliar. They were, by default, dangerous. Something to be assessed carefully before being trusted, and often not trusted at all. Then, starting around 10,000 years ago, that world collapsed inward. Humans stopped moving, started farming, and populations began stacking on top of each other. The first settlements weren't planned. They grew. And the people inside them were running biological and psychological software that had been calibrated over hundreds of thousands of years for a world of 50 people, suddenly being asked to function in a world of thousands. The earliest evidence of what that collision actually looked like in bodies is not from ancient texts, it is from the bones themselves. Çatalhöyük, in what is now southern Turkey, is one of the world's oldest proto-urban communities. At its peak, roughly between 7,100 and 5,950 BCE, somewhere between 3,500 and 8,000 people lived there simultaneously. Bioarchaeologist Clark Spencer Larson of Ohio State University led a team that spent 25 years excavating and analyzing the human remains at the site. What they found was not the peaceful cradle of civilization story that early city narratives tend to tell. It was a community under extraordinary biological stress. Up to 1/3 of skeletal remains from the site's busiest period showed bone-level evidence of infection. The houses had no streets between them. Residents entered and exited through holes in the rooftops, climbing down ladders into rooms that opened directly onto other rooms. Animal pens and trash pits sat immediately outside the walls. Analysis of those walls found traces of both animal and human fecal matter pressed into the clay. The body was not built for this. The immune systems of people whose ancestors had spent millennia spread across open landscapes were now contending with concentrated disease vectors that had no historical precedent in human experience. The diet told a parallel story. Analysis of teeth from Çatalhöyük's peak period found that roughly 13% of women and 10% of men had significant dental cavities, the direct result of a grain-heavy diet that replaced the varied, protein-rich diet of their foraging ancestors. Leg bones showed that residents in the city's later years were walking significantly further than earlier inhabitants, almost certainly because nearby farmland had been exhausted and resources had moved outward. The body was being asked to do more, on worse fuel, in a more disease-saturated environment than anything in its evolutionary history had prepared it for. And it was not just the body that was struggling. The sensory world of the first city was itself a kind of assault. Imagine stepping out of a landscape where the loudest regular sound was wind, rain, or the movement of animals, where silence was the default and noise was information, a signal that something nearby required attention. Now place that same nervous system inside Çatalhöyük at peak population. Thousands of people in continuous proximity, animals in pens directly outside, cooking fires burning in enclosed spaces, the smell of livestock, of waste, of hundreds of unwashed bodies in close quarters. The brain that evolved to treat unexpected noise as a potential threat had no off switch for this. There was no quiet hour, no empty corridor, no moment when the sensory input dropped back to the baseline that human biology had been tuned against for 300,000 years. What we would recognize today as chronic stress, elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep, persistent low-level anxiety, was probably not an occasional feature of early urban life. It was a structural condition of it. But the physical toll was only half of it. Imagine you are one of those early residents. You grew up in a band where everybody's business was everybody's business by default. There was no such thing as privacy, but there was also no such thing as anonymity. Everyone who could see you also knew you. Now you are in Çatalhöyük at its peak, surrounded by thousands of people, most of whom you will never know well enough to trust, but whose proximity you cannot escape. You cannot walk away from a conflict. You cannot put distance between yourself and someone who has wronged you. The old hunter-gatherer pressure valve, simply moving on, is gone. There was something even more quietly devastating in that loss. Hunter-gatherer bands operated on what anthropologists call fission-fusion dynamics. When social tension rose inside the group, part of it would simply split off, move, regroup, and allow the friction to dissipate with distance and time. No confrontation required, no formal resolution, just space. The city removed that option entirely. Every grievance, every territorial dispute over shared walls or shared resources, every accumulated resentment between neighbors had nowhere to go. The pressure built inside a fixed container, with no release valve and no exit. But the most disturbing thing crowding did to us wasn't in their teeth or their guts. It was in their skulls. The bones tell you what happened next. In a sample of 93 skulls excavated from Çatalhöyük, 25 showed evidence of healed fractures, more than 1 in 4. 12 of those individuals had been struck more than once. The shape of the wounds matched hard, round objects, and clay balls of exactly the right size were found across the site. More than half of the victims were women, most struck from behind or above, which means they were not facing whoever hit them. Larson found that the violence increased specifically during the middle period, when the population was at its densest. The crowding wasn't just making people sick, it was making them dangerous to each other. This was not a problem unique to Çatalhöyük, it was structural. Evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar of Oxford University spent decades studying the relationship between human brain size and social group complexity. His conclusion, now widely known as Dunbar's number, is that the human neocortex evolved to manage a stable social network of roughly 150 people, the number within which you can track relationships, remember obligations, and maintain the kind of trust that makes cooperation work. Beyond that, the cognitive load of managing relationships exceeds what the brain was designed to handle without institutional support. You stop knowing people and start categorizing them. The first cities were not building on top of a social system that could handle them. They were smashing through its ceiling. What emerged in response was something new. Institutions designed to do the work that personal relationships used to do. Laws, because you can no longer rely on community pressure to enforce behavior. Priests and temples, because shared ritual creates a sense of obligation between people who have never met. Markets, because trust between strangers requires a system that doesn't depend on knowing the other person personally. Hierarchy, because someone has to make decisions for a group too large to reach consensus by discussion around a fire. None of these solutions were inevitable or clean. The Sumerian city of Uruk, one of the world's first true cities, reached a population of around 40 to 50,000 people by 3100 BCE. It had temples, grain stores, administrators, and a scribal class responsible for managing resources and recording transactions. It also had, for the first time in human history, a formal ruling class, people whose authority was not earned through demonstrated competence in full view of everyone they governed, but inherited, institutionalized, and enforced. For a species that had spent 300,000 years operating what anthropologist Christopher Bohm called a reverse dominance hierarchy, actively and sometimes violently pulling down anyone who tried to accumulate too much power, this was not a comfortable adaptation. It was a necessary one. The psychological workaround, it turns out, was religion, not in the abstract philosophical sense, but in the deeply practical sense of giving strangers a shared identity large enough to override the biological distrust that proximity to the unfamiliar automatically triggered. The temples at Uruk were not just places of worship, they were administrative centers, grain redistribution hubs, and the primary employers of the city's labor force. The god at the top of the hierarchy was a fiction everyone agreed to, which meant that a farmer from one district and a metal worker from another could conduct business without knowing each other personally, because both of them were accountable to the same divine authority. Anthropologist Ara Norenzayan of the University of British Columbia has called this the rise of big gods, powerful, moralizing, all-seeing deities whose surveillance extended to every transaction, every interaction, every corner of a city too large for human eyes to monitor. Before formal legal systems existed, the fear of divine punishment was the glue holding strangers together in the same street. And yet, somehow, people stayed. They did not scatter back to the open steppe in anything like the numbers that might have been expected, because for all the violence and disease and hierarchy and noise, cities also offered something the band never could: scale. Skills you would never encounter in 50 people, foods you could never produce alone, protection you could never provide yourself, ideas that required more than one lifetime to develop. The city was genuinely terrible in ways that left marks in bone. It was also the most productive environment our species had ever inhabited. The first urban humans did not thrive because city life was easy. They survived it because the cognitive and social tools that evolution had given them, coalition building, ritual, hierarchy, trade, law, turned out to be exactly what was needed to make a world of strangers livable. They just had to invent all of them under pressure, at scale, with no model to follow.